Emma was 8 the first time she realized that her voice could cause storms. Not literal storms, of course, but storms in the small, delicate world of her house. A simple question, "Why did you yell?" Or a fleeting laugh could ripple through her parents' tempers like a dropped pebble in a still pond, and suddenly the room was heavy with tension, the air sharp with disapproval. So she learned to stay quiet. She folded herself into corners, became fluent in silence, and watched the world with wide, cautious eyes. It was a skill, really, a survival skill. When Emma stayed quiet, the world calmed. She became invisible enough that the room stopped trembling. She learned to anticipate moods before anyone expressed them, to soften the edges of conflict with the subtle tilts of her posture, the careful pauses of her words. Every glance, every tone, every shift in air became a signal, and she became fluent in reading them. But the paradox of her life was cruel. The very silence that had saved her as a child now followed her like a shadow. Meetings, friendships, romantic moments, even her own thoughts, echoed with caution. Do not speak. Do not be seen. Be careful. What had once been protection became a weight. Emma wasn't shy and she wasn't cold. She was hyper-alert, finely tuned to notice every tremor of danger, every hint of disapproval. The child who had mastered invisibility had grown into a young woman who wondered why intimacy felt impossible, why claiming space seemed unnatural, why ambition felt like risk. She carried the wisdom of survival and the grief of suppression in the same chest. At school, her teachers called her quiet or shy. Friends noticed she often retreated to the back of the classroom, her notebook clutched as a shield. Psychologists later would call patterns like hers highly vigilant quietism, a response to environments where speaking up felt dangerous. This was not simple introversion. It was an adaptation honed in childhood trauma, a nervous system permanently alert, scanning for invisible threats. Emma's relationships at home had taught her avoidant attachment before she even knew the term. Her emotional needs were quieted, not because they weren't real, but because expressing them had always carried a price. She had learned parentification without realizing it, becoming a miniature caretaker, diffusing tension, smoothing moods, keeping the fragile peace intact, all while suppressing her own emotions. Her brain remembered. The amygdala, her fear center, stayed active long after the danger had passed. Her prefrontal cortex linked reasoning with caution, calculating every social interaction for safety. Even her default mode network, her inner narrative, was tied to scanning for potential threats. Every moment of calm carried the residual hum of vigilance. Every breath carried the echo of her silent training. Do not speak. Do not upset the balance. The cost of this silence was enormous. Emma carried invisible grief like a backpack weighted with unspoken words, lost tears, and moments she could never reclaim. Fear shadowed every choice. Fear of judgment, fear of conflict, fear of visibility. Even happiness carried risk. Being fully present meant being seen, and being seen had always been dangerous. Sacrificing herself had become habitual. She grieved in private. She carried shame for needing love, needing attention, needing acknowledgement. Philosophers have long described this tension. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For Emma, accepting herself was terrifying because her survival instincts and her authenticity had always seemed opposed. Every attempt to speak, to assert, to demand, was a tightrope walk over invisible flames. Years passed and Emma's silence evolved into adult behaviors. At work, she let others take credit for her ideas, shrinking in meetings to avoid attention. In relationships, she deferred constantly, afraid her desires would provoke disappointment or conflict. Socially, she overanalyzed every gesture, every phrase, calculating safety before expression. Boundaries were difficult. Saying no felt like defiance. Emotionally, she carried shame for traits that were survival strategies, not flaws. Creatively, she hesitated, fearing her voice was too loud or too bold. Spiritually, she felt quietly alienated, as if life were unfolding at a remove, observed but never fully inhabited. Each behavior was not a defect. It was a coping strategy, a survival instinct coded into decades of practice. Recognition was the first step toward change. Emma began to see her patterns not as failings, but as evidence of her strength, the strength it took to survive. Witnessing, without judgment, allowed her to begin the process of unlearning. Unlearning was gradual. Emma practiced speaking in small ways, asking for what she needed, saying no gently, expressing a thought in a meeting. Each act of self-expression was a rehearsal, a nervous system recalibrating, a child long silenced learning to breathe. She realized the child inside her needed permission. You are safe now. You are allowed to exist. You are allowed to speak. Therapy helped. Shadow work illuminated the parts of her she had silenced for decades. Journaling gave voice to the thoughts she had hidden, while mindfulness and somatic practices helped her body learn safety for the first time in years. She began to reclaim her creativity, her joy, her presence. Rainer Maria Rilke once said, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves." Healing was not about erasing the past or pretending the silence had never existed. It was about integrating it, honoring the survival instincts that had kept her alive, and choosing to exist fully now. Emma discovered that she was not broken. She was whole even in her scars. The silence that had protected her as a child could now be a tool, a lens, a source of empathy, wisdom, and depth. She could finally be loud, soft, angry, joyful, vulnerable, on her own terms. Every whisper she had feared to speak carried truth, and she was learning to let them rise. To exist fully, Emma realized, is not radical. It is reclamation. Her journey was not about becoming someone else but about becoming fully, unapologetically herself. The silence she had mastered for survival was no longer a prison. It was the foundation from which she could finally stand, speak, and be heard. And in this reclamation she understood the deepest truth: she was allowed to speak. She was allowed to exist. She was allowed to be seen, and finally she was ready to be fully, bravely herself.